Hi, Rita. How are you?
Hi, I'm just fine.
Thank you very much for joining my class. I know that this is a very busy time for you, and you are taking time to help me teach this class. I greatly appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to do it since I'm stuck at home with the coronavirus, social isolation, whatever, distancing. And
That's
so
right.
I'm working from home, and that's why the background is a little unusual. It's not my office. I'm looking out the balcony from my living room.
Thank you very much. So
Hmm.
I want to introduce you to members of my class. Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock has been a friend of mine for over 3 decades. She is Vice President of Volunteers for America, one of the most noted feminist theologians in the United States. Because Rita, I remembered in 1988, you authored one of the first books on feminist Christology. That is your award-winning book, Journey by Heart. And afterwards, you co-authored several very important books, like Casting Stone, Proverbs of Ashes, and Saving Paradise, and also Moral Injury, a few that you are really the national expertise. And I'm so glad that you are going to share with us some of your thoughts on Christology, on atonement theory, and on why suffering and also the cross is problematic for Christians. Why don't you start by sharing with us your own theological and personal journey?
Sure. It's a little unusual for me to have even wound up being a Christian theologian because I was born in Japan to a Japanese Buddhist family. My mother was made pregnant by a military soldier because she was an army hospital nurse. And my birth father left when I was 6 months old, and he was never part of my life. But so for 5 years, I pretty much lived with my grandparents. My mother and I lived with my grandparents. And it was a very difficult time in the country of Japan because they just survived two nuclear explosions and the end of a major world war. And my family home is actually 60 miles from Nagasaki. So in my mother's generation and my grandparents, both, almost everyone died of some kind of cancer in their 50s. And so there's a lot of suffering and tragedy behind the story of my childhood, but I was mostly protected from that by my grandparents. And my grandmother was the person who took care of me and my four male cousins while all of our parents worked, because everybody had to work. Every adult had to work in that time. It was a very poor country. So during the day, I spent time with my cousins and my grandmother. And in the evenings, when my grandmother was making dinner and preparing the bath for everyone, those big hot baths, she had to put the wood in and heat the bath. And so my grandfather and I would play in the evenings. So my memory of my first 5 years was living in a close, caring, kind family. And then my mother married my stepfather, who was a white person from rural Mississippi, another US Army soldier. And when I was 6, I was moved to Fort Riley, Kansas, and grew up for all of my grammar school years on a military base. So I had this experience of an integrated US military with very diverse friends growing up in school, but also a lot of hostility to being Japanese. So my mother and father decided I would not speak Japanese. They decided I would just be as American as possible. And every summer we would go to Amory, Mississippi with my dad because he would take his month vacation in August so we could help his brother-in-law bring in his cotton crop. So as a child, I picked cotton and played with my white cousins and went to a lot of Southern Baptist, Southern Methodist revival services with all those preachers that preach fear of hell and being saved and those sorts of things. And I could never make any sense of that kind of Christianity, partly because the kind of emotional spectacle you had to make of yourself in front of strangers is just not something a Japanese person would ever do.
Mm.
It seemed very narcissistic and exhibitionary to me. So I never got saved. Besides the fact that I didn't understand the theology, I just thought what kind of person who says they love you would do something like hell? It just, none of it made sense. And so most of my Christian upbringing was by Army Protestant ministers who were chaplains. They're not allowed to proselytize. They're not allowed to tell you you're going to go to hell unless you're saved, that kind of thing. That just didn't happen on the military base. And so that was just a different kind of Protestantism that was sort of vaguely Protestant. And I think one of the Sunday school teachers I had in that period told us we should read the Bible. So I read it from beginning to end. I read the whole thing when I was about 11. And mostly it didn't make a lot of sense to me, but what I was left with was an impression that the God in the Bible was pretty mean and that Jesus was a rude person. So it was just not something that I could see as any form of something that made sense. And that was true for me all the way through high school. But when I was in my junior year of high school, my best friend was the Baptist minister's daughter. So I wound up being baptized by her father, who was a fundamentalist, but he was willing to baptize me even though I believed in evolution, which I thought was very generous of him. And I think I did claim that I believed that Jesus was my personal Lord and Savior, but I don't think I understood what that meant, except that I wanted to be part of his community because his daughter was my best friend. And my father had gone to Vietnam for 2 tours. So he was a good minister and made sure our family was okay. And so he became a kind of father figure for me. But I have to say, Jesus didn't make any sense to me until I went to college. And I wound up taking an Old Testament course and some New Testament courses. And once I discovered the Jewish justice and mercy traditions that for me spoke to the fact that I had become a civil rights activist, that it was a revelation to me to discover this was a 3,000-year-old tradition and that Jesus had been a major figure in the movement for justice and mercy as a Jewish rabbi. And then he made sense to me. And I think I sort of became a Christian in college as a follower of this long legacy of justice and mercy that is embodied in the work of Jesus and the Christian church. And so I wound up joining a denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, because they had a very active civil rights church in Los Angeles, and I was attending college in Southern California. So that's how I sort of wound up within Christianity as someone who was taking it pretty seriously. And my Bible professor in college talked me into graduate school. And the longer I stayed in school, the more interesting religion became to me, and especially theological questions. So that's how I actually wound up getting a PhD in theology. But I also became a feminist in that process also. So critique of patriarchy and all kinds of things emerged all at once for me. First it was the civil rights movement, then there was feminism and then anti-racism work, and then LGBT issues. So those things have always informed the way I think theologically. But as part of my journey in seminary and graduate school, I spent 14 years in the summertime volunteering as a counselor in a summer high school program run by the Los Angeles School District. And it was a human relations program that worked on racism, sexism, homophobia, and addiction, and all kinds of issues that affect high school students. And my dissertation in the book Journeys by Heart actually grew out of my observations in a real world context, counseling people who came from abusive families or families with addiction or just difficult family environments, that the more they believed the atonement theology, that we are so bad that Jesus had to die for us or we would all go to hell, which was how I learned it in high school, that the more deeply they believed that, the more they were likely to believe that their parents who, beat them so badly they wound up in hospital, or who sexually abused them or did really terrible things to them, the more they believed in this idea that Jesus died for their sins, the more they were willing to believe that their parents loved them and they were bad, and their parents wouldn't be doing those things to them unless they were bad. So what I concluded in that process was that it was more important to them to believe their parents loved them no matter what they did to them, and for them to believe that they were bad than they were willing to judge their parents for their behavior. And so I started hearing in the way they talked about their parents, the way theology talks about humans as so sinful and so awful that we deserve the torture and murder that happened to Jesus, but he took it on for us. And that really bothered me. And so I wound up making my dissertation project a way to think beyond that, by focusing the sort of human analysis in the book around the way abused children talk about their parents and how Christianity talks about God in the same way.
Thank you so much. Yes.
That's how I got to a dissertation project.
Yeah, it's very much linked to your own personal journey. You are asked to think how our childhood, our family, and our churches may shape the way we relate to Jesus and think about Christology.
Yeah.
Are there other Christian understandings of salvation?
Yeah. Well, I actually started to pursue this even more. And so Proverbs of Ashes and Saving Paradise are sort of a 30-year journey I was taking theologically around these questions. And so the one I just described, that Jesus substitutes for us because we would deserve this terrible thing that happened to him, but since he was innocent and pure, he could do it on our behalf. That's substitutionary theory of the atonement. It's a very common way of thinking about it. But I think the liberal church has a worse version, which I didn't really think through totally in that dissertation, which is that when that theology, the idea of substitution, Jesus substitutes for us, was written in 1098. So 1,000 years after the Christian church was formed, it was written down as a systematic idea of salvation. So it's really like fairly new. It's only halfway through the Christian history that it emerges. But when it came out, a critic of it, that was about, Anselm wrote the theology. His critic Abelard said, it's not a very flattering picture of God, that he is so thin-skinned that when we're sinful, he can't accept us as we are. And he says, he actually said, who will forgive God for murdering his own son? That was his critique of a God who requires that kind of harm in order to right this insult to his honor. And so he said, no, that's not why the atonement happened, that we are sinful, that we are terrible, that what happened to Jesus is a function of human sin. But what happens is that God loves us so much that he sent his son to take on the sin, to reveal to us how terrible we are. It's an act of love of God to show us a better way. And that when we recognize that Jesus suffered and took this on, that we see the love of God revealed in that act, and we become like Jesus and are willing to forgive unto death. So that's called the moral influence theory. It's called that. So Jesus is our model for how it is to have God in us and love. So what that model is what liberals prefer, because then you can preserve the idea of a good and caring God and a sinful humanity, but see that interaction makes us better, transforms us. So what that resulted in is that Abelard describes love as passive, as self-sacrifice. So the most supreme form of love is to suffer so deeply you go into self-sacrifice. And that's the kind of theology that's been given to women who are in situations of domestic violence, that if you love like Jesus, you will endure it and forgive. And the same with children. So I think it's actually worse than the other because it asks people to be victims and to be complicit with harm, to actually do nothing to resist evil. So both of those, the substitutionary and the moral influence theory, the problem with them is they hang everything on the crucifixion. They make the crucifixion absolutely necessary for God to have effected salvation. I think that's the basic problem with those theologies. So it turns out that the early church had a much more rich and complex and life-affirming understanding of salvation, in which they acknowledge the crucifixion happens and it's a terrible thing, but they don't hang salvation on it. They actually believe that God became human in Jesus to teach us how to be the best kind of human person with the Spirit in us. So they, Athanasius says God became human so humanity might become divine. He's a 4th century theologian. A 2nd century bishop articulated it. He's the first source we have outside the Bible for how church is thinking theologically. And his name was Irenaeus. He was a bishop of a church that was persecuted, so that Christians weren't allowed to go out in public. The bishop before him had been martyred. He was also martyred. So he wasn't living in a happy democracy where everybody was free and everything. He lived in a difficult time as a Christian, and yet he says that the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And what that meant for him was that God had planted the paradise on earth as the place for human habitation. That paradise was not the afterlife, it was this life when it was lived well. And that the problem is that Adam and Eve got into trouble and couldn't take moral responsibility for their mistakes, and they were too young to know what they were doing. So we got locked out of that world. So Jesus came to show us what it meant to live in paradise, which is to heal the sick, to feed the hungry, to teach the ignorant, and to do good work in the world, form a community of care and loving care, and work for justice. That was the story of his life in the Gospels. That was the responsibility of belonging in paradise. So you got baptized into paradise. Paradise doors opened up when you were baptized. So then you were in a community taking on this responsibility. And how that was understood is, he says, the church is planted as the paradise in this world. That was the mission of the church, was to help human life flourish. So Jesus's death was a victory over the principalities and powers of death, that he was resurrected, and that meant that death did not have the final word, that a martyr's death was not the end of their life, and Jesus's death was not the end of his life, that he lives on in the resurrection, and that the dead go to another neighborhood of the same earthly paradise, but since Satan can't cross the veil of death, they get to rest there, and they get to hear the prayers of the living and visit to give spiritual comfort. So the church believed that the Feast of Abundant Life, which was the Eucharist, was hosted by the risen Christ, that at every Eucharist feast, he returned from paradise where he was resting, and he came back and visited every Eucharist feast so he could host the table and give abundant life to everybody. And all the dead also visited. So they had this sense of the oneness of life coming together as a celebration of the love and abundance of God in the Eucharist feast. And because, of course, the serpent was in the garden before the fall, they understood that this life had struggle in it. But the point wasn't to suffer. The point was to alleviate suffering so that there could be joy and happiness and love in life. It's a very different sense of what it means to be a Christian than to know that you are Christian because you suffer. That rather you are Christian because you're in a community of responsibility and care, resisting all the forces of suffering and death that try to deny human flourishing. So that's how I wound up writing Saving Paradise. That actually is the book that describes that earlier version of Christianity. But and then I have been working more and more recently on trauma, because Shelley Rambo, a theologian's been writing recently on trauma. She's also a feminist theologian. And the feminist theologians 25, 30 years ago began to reject the atonement. But then she said, so we all stopped writing on trauma, and we need to figure out how to write on trauma without thinking that trauma saves us. And so I thought that was true. And so it was about the same time she was writing, I was also working on moral injury, which is a profound kind of suffering that comes from violating your moral conscience, either because you do something, or you witness something, or you experience harm that shatters your belief in any kind of human goodness or even in yourself. And so it's a devastating form of suffering. But I think what's interesting about moral injury, which also to me defies atonement theology, is I am now hearing psychiatrists and scientists who don't make claims. They don't make ontological claims and say, well, human beings are essentially like this. That's what theologians do. That's our job. And a lot of theologians say we are essentially sinful, right? That's why we need salvation. The psychiatrists are saying, no, we're born moral. Our essence is a profound moral conscience that comes to life in the love and relationships of our lives, but is there no matter what. And I actually do believe that. I believe we're born moral because we're born needing love. And the only way you can maintain relationships of love is to figure out how to be a good person so other people will love you back. And when you break that, when you do something that violates everything you've been taught is what a good person does, because of some accident, or somebody who's supposed to love you treats you badly, it's a major kind of suffering. It breaks your love system, it breaks your identity, it breaks your capacity to connect to other people. But the sign of that brokenness to me is the sign that your conscience is still there. It's still working. It's just now beating you up because it can't figure out how to reground itself in love and relationship. And so I've been spending the last 10 years figuring out, how then do we address moral injury? How do we repair that broken soul that has lost its grounding in the Spirit of God? But it's not because that soul is sinful. That's because that soul has encountered something that its morality can't make sense of. So that's how I have been working around this atonement. And the longer I've worked in it, the more I'm seeing other fellow travelers who also reject this idea that human beings are sinful, and the only way we can be saved is to turn our complete will and everything over to this powerful force that controls everything.
Thank you so much for talking to us, because
Yeah.
you've given us much food for thought. And I am sure when we discuss the writing and watch this recording, we will learn much more. And
you're welcome to email me with questions. I love questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great conversation. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.